So I'm just going to dive into my paper. My paper is called An Exploration of Personal Conceptions of Rag and Rag Sangeet. This entire seminar, as you know, has been titled Creativity and the Khayal. Now, creativity in the context of the Khayal genre of music making, by which I mean North Indian classical or Hindustani music, as it is commonly known, operates within the fundamental frameworks of rag, tal, and bandish. For those who are very new to this, a rag is a melodic framework upon which a performer of Hindustani music improvises. Tal is a rhythmic framework, and the bandish is the composition within that. This paper focuses on a particular rag, Rag Shri, and through it at the idea of rag itself. I will try to look at rag as a seed idea, within which one important dimension of the musician's creative process is encapsulated, and from which it emerges in performance. An interesting way of describing a rag is a melodic construct that lies somewhere on the continuum between a raw scale and a fully composed tune. As a conception of rag in a musician's mind moves between this continuum, between the scale end and the tune end, it represents various kinds and degrees of fixity of form, within and around which the musician explores his own personal musical idiom. The question of what is fixed and what is not fixed in Hindustani music. This is an improvised genre of music for those who don't know, often compared with jazz. It's a complex subject, the term improvised, but just as an introduction. So the question of what is fixed and what is not fixed in Hindustani music is a complex one. One important dimension to this question is that of the degree and nature of fixity of the rag as the musician conceives of it. This paper presents the results of an experiment, a small experiment carried out to shed light on the degree and nature of fixedness or unfixedness of the rag group in the performance processes of two musicians, Pandit Kumar Gandharva and Ustad Amir Khan, who many of you might have heard. These are two musicians who are widely acknowledged to fundamentally differ from each other in their processes of music making. I've used a traditional metaphor to try to explain how they go about their creative processes. The metaphor of the seed. The term seed ideas is a traditional metaphor and has been put to good use by a scholar called Adrian McNeill, who uses it to propose a model to try to describe the creative process in terms that are more sophisticated and nuanced than composition or improvisation. These terms, composition and improvisation, belong to another ontology altogether. They belong to another culture. And they are seen as opposing, as contrasting, contradicting each other. You have something that is composed and something that is improvised. And these have been found by many people unsuitable to describe what really happens in the performance of a raga. Instead, McNeill uses the metaphor of the seed to represent units of potential. Units of potential. Something Dr. Ranade calls Sarjaka Kendra. I think this is what he means. Units of potential that are creatively expanded or grown during the performance of a raga. More specifically, these are fixed melodic, rhythmic, and structural materials that have a potential for growth in the context of a performance. Now, what is this material? This material includes the melodic ingredients that define the rag itself, the song form that's being performed, by which I mean the genre, it might be khyal in this case, as opposed to say dhrupad or thumri, which imply different things, different ways of growth in performance, and a different kind or degree of fixity. So the melodic ingredients of the rag itself, the song form, and the particular song, the particular bandish chosen for performance, which might impose another layer of fixity over the performance. Rather than fixity, I might say constraints over the performance, the nature and degree of which vary with the performer, and which includes the tal it is set to, the rhythm cycle it is set to, as well as its tempo. Now, McNeill groups all of these fixities under the term fixed melodic ingredients to contrast them with fixities of method, fixed ideas of what you do with these ingredients. These fixities of method might include predetermined seed, rhythmic, or melodic devices that an artist employs across all of his performances of various ragas and bandishes. For example, as we know in Hindustani music, what is called the ashtangas, the boltan, the alap, you might have tihais, various devices. So fixities of melody and fixities of method. All of these fixities are, in McNeill's conception, seeds, which will sprout or grow and give musical yield when fertilized by the creative process of the artist. This paper is an attempt to identify the seed ideas of melody that make up the rag roop of Rag Shri, as sung by Pandit Kumar Gandharva and Ustad Amir Khan. I investigate here the personal conceptions, and I'd like to stress this again, the personal conceptions of Rag Shri in particular, as well as of the idea of Rag in general, as encountered in the performances of these two very different musicians. Just to give you an example of how, you'll hear recordings of them, but an example of how different these two are, I attended a workshop by Pandit Ulhas Kashalkar, the well-known musician for students of music, and a remark he passed was that many people like to draw influences from various styles of music making to enrich their own musical idiom. So he said, I encourage that. But if you want to do that, make sure the styles that you incorporate are compatible with each other. And as an example of two styles that are completely incompatible, he spoke of Kumarji and Amir Khan. Okay. Now, Pandit Kumar Gandharva, Kumarji, famously described the many facets of a rag as exemplified by various bandishes in that rag as profiles. The various bandishes in the rag, he called profiles of a rag. They show you different facets of a rag. This term, profiles, can be recycled to suggest that the various manifestations of a single rag, as molded by the personal idioms and aesthetics of artists of different training and temperament, are also profiles of that rag. Another scholar, Nicholas Magriel, who I draw from for this paper, uses the metaphor of language to give us a very interesting and a more precise term for this idea. He creates a hierarchy of rag groups. He calls them languages of rags. The languages of rags are those grammatical tendencies which are adhered to by most musicians. There's a consensus, a general understanding of Rag Shri, for instance. Then you have dialects of rags. These are additional features which are held in common by one gharana or by one stylistically consistent group. And beyond that, you have idiolects of rags, from idio meaning self. Idiolects of rags, the specific refinements practiced by individual musicians. So, I found this to be a very tempting idea, idiolects of rags. So now bringing McNeill's and Magriel's ideas together, we arrive at the idea of an idiolect of a rag, an artist's personal conception of the rag, which might be described or defined to some extent or described as a collection of specific seed ideas, specific seed melodic material. This is the rag group that lies at the root of all of that artist's creative activity within the rag. So I found that it was a tempting proposition to see if you could actually identify a rag as sung by an artist across his performances. Now, this guy, Magriel, proposes a method, a technique to derive or distill such a personal idiolectical framework of a rag based on a close analysis of recorded performances of the artist. The goal is to arrive at a set of seed ideas or core phrases of the rag as found in the artist's performance of it. Now, Magriel does this using the following procedure, so that you don't have to read the whole thing if it looks scary, but basically the first section, initial transcription, that's just a notation of the entire performance. So he proposes that you transcribe the entire performance in simple notation. The numbers represent the rhythm cycles, avartans. So it's 20 avartans. So this is his transcription of a performance of Rag Shahana Kannada by Niyaz Ahmad Khan Sahib. So you transcribe it like that, and then you break it down to a simplified transcription using digits for notes, just to make it universally readable. And what he does there is he gets rid of a lot of the ornamentation in an attempt to arrive at core phrases. And then you isolate the core phrases like that. So what he does there is 671, which is Dhani Sa. He identifies as a core phrase, and he finds that the artist sings that in various ways before moving on to another one on the right, 2171. So it's not important. The thing is basically identifying melodic seed ideas within the performance. Yeah, so dha ni sa dha ni sa. I'm reading it vertically. Yeah, ma ni dha ni sa ni dha ni sa ni dha. Now this doesn't sound like Shahana yet, but this is how he sung it. Dha ni sa ni dha ni sa. You'd have to have heard Niyaz Ahmad to imagine how he would sing this. No, there are dots below the notes, which means it's a lower octave. dha ni sa. Then you have dha pa ma pa dha ni sa, and then you move on to the right to re sa ni sa. This is a new phase. It is completely disconnected with what was going on before this. So he separates it. That in a nutshell is a procedure. I don't want to go into this because it is a little problematic, but just wanted to show it to you because this was my starting point. So you streamline the notation in this way. And he goes through this entire process and comes up with an eventual distilled sort of rag group of Shahana Kannada, which he arranges in a linear Aroh-Avroh pattern. And that is the rag Shahana according to Niyaz Ahmed Khan Sahab. So what this process gives us is a set of seed ideas or seed phrases, the fixed melodic material out of which Niyaz Ahmed Khan extracts his Shahana in performance. Now, Magriel's motivation for doing all this is to address what he calls the significant gap that exists between theory and practice in North Indian music, and to therefore attempt a codification of raga grammar as found in actual performance based on empirical evidence. He argues that this method is justified because rag grammar is traditionally learned in the Guru Shishya tradition by imitating the syntax of the sound one hears, which is what this procedure tries to emulate. Now, although this approach did seem immediately problematic to me in many ways, it seemed like a tempting proposition nonetheless. And I began by trying to derive such idiolects for Rag Shri, as sung by Amir Khan Sahab and Kumarji, to see where it would take me. So this paper describes the results of this experiment. Now, the Rag that I chose was the early evening Rag Shri. The choice of the Rag was admittedly slightly arbitrary. The only criteria was that it be a Rag that is relatively well defined, by which I mean concise in its structure. So as compared to a Yaman Kalyan or a Todi, the Shri is a more manageable beast. Otherwise I'd go crazy. But, and the two artists, Kumarji and Amir Khan, were chosen for my own familiarity with their music and with discourse about their music, as well as for being widely acknowledged as representing two radically different approaches, as I mentioned before, to the Khyal tradition as a whole. For Amir Khan, I worked with the only 3 available recorded performances of Shri that are available. In all these performances, he sings Bhatkhande's composition Hari Ke Charana Kamal in Jhaptal. And these are 27 minutes, 18 minutes, and 15 minutes in length. There are no dates, but I'm pretty sure they're all from the late 60s. And they're all live performances. For Kumar Gandharva, I worked with 4 recordings that I chose from among many more that are available. These consist of 2 performances of the Vilambit Khyal, Pava Mein Dura Se Dare Se Tero, of which there is a 63-minute long performance, a live performance, as well as a shorter 32-minute performance. One from his earlier days, one from his later days. And the other 2 are both live recordings, which contain his other faster tempo, Madhyalaya and Drut compositions. Risai Kahe Moparari, Sanja Kahe Jaye, Karinde Kachulalare, and the Tarana. Now, apart from the Tarana, which is traditional, all the bandishes that Kumarji sings in his Shri are all his own compositions. It's an important fact that will... So now in trying to derive these idiolects, I began by following Nicholas Magriel's method. But as I went along, I found that I had to deviate from it in several ways. Obviously, the biggest challenge in the process was isolating these core phrases with any sort of conviction from the musician's melodic statements, from his lines. The reason it is difficult to convince oneself of the accuracy of these phrases, that the phrases that one arrives at, is a lurking doubt about whether the singer is really thinking of the phrases, of the rag, in these terms. This entire activity becomes meaningless if one disregards the singer's intention. The singer's intentionality is thus at the core of this activity. This becomes then almost a hermeneutical exercise, an exercise of interpretatively deriving a vocabulary and a grammar from within the performance of a rag and arriving at an understanding of how a rag's vocabulary and its grammar relate to each other. The problem of articulation, of what could be called kehen, of how an artist articulates his phrases, further complicates things. Each core phrase or seed idea has a number of articulations that deviate from the core, from this imagined core, to a greater or lesser degree. Now, Magriel tackles this problem by simplifying the notation to get rid of most ornamentation. I find this to be problematic since it amounts to a complete negation of the singer's intentionality in singing these phrases. Each differing articulation of a phrase wouldn't exist if it didn't serve a slightly different purpose. So, at the very least, then, to reach some sort of a compromise, there have to be more convincing grounds based on which to assign these articulations to a single category. So, I test my phrase groups, my categories, with the following criteria. Can you substitute one articulation for the other with a similar overall melodic result? Does repeating the articulations within one group, and this will become clearer when I actually show you and play the clips for you, does repeating the articulations one after the other result in the effect of stressing the same idea repeatedly? Does the artist sing a particular articulation frequently enough to give it a distinct identity, independent of the others in the group? So the groups I thus formed, taking these criteria into regard, are labeled using the sargam notation of the phrase. So for example, re pa could be one category. Re pa. Now he could articulate this in various ways, but the sense you get is that what he wants to say is re pa. The sense he wants to give is re pa in Shri. So then re pa becomes the core phrase. Now as we go along, we have to tackle the problem of the longer melodic statements in the performance that could be viewed as combinations of two or more core phrases. Now, Magriel restricts his analysis to Alap, to the Alap section only. He doesn't venture into Sargam and Tan territory at all. Tan passages are especially tricky because they are faster and longer and often cover the entire octave or more. So they usually involve movements between multiple core phrases, often with overlaps. But about the Tans, on closer investigation, I found that in general, the Sapat Tans tend to span most often 1 to 1.5 octaves in a single direction, most often descending, and can be convincingly brought together in either a simple descent or a simple ascent category. Vakratans, the twisted tans, betray the artist's process of attempting to combine core phrases and can be translated into alap sentences, as you will see. Combining core phrases, and they could be translated into alap sentences that clearly show sequences of core phrases. And there are certainly exceptional cases where representing a particular longer sentence as a combination of two or more core phrases is obviously forced, and a new phrase group has to be created. Okay, I should also mention that this Nicholas Magriel's approach of working only with the Alap section of Niaz Ahmad Khan's recording and omitting the Tan and Sargam sections entirely becomes completely meaningless in the case of a singer like Kumarji, because he does not have a separable Alap section or a separable Tan section, right? As you're familiar with his music, anything can happen at any point. His performances are not sequential. So after going through a large number of iterations, we finally come to a set of core phrases. So the seed ideas that Kumarji's and Amir Khan's respective idiolects of Shri are made up of. This is of course only Kumarji. So some comments about these phrases. Yeah, but before you do that, some comments about these phrases. So except for phrase number 14, Rima Panisa, which spans the entire octave, these core phrases are not octave specific. They could be in any octave. They are not in any particular order. These are not intended to be a sequential chalan as is traditionally presented, Aro and Avro. Most notes of the scale, including the unlikely Gandhar and Nishad, numbers 2 and 10, have been called phrases by themselves. Interestingly, Magriel defines a phrase as the melody between pauses. This is a simplification perhaps, but it takes on special significance in the context of Kumarji's music. Kumarji's pauses have sometimes been attributed to his physical disability, but more nuanced understandings of his idiom have attributed them to a deliberate aesthetic stance. Kumarji's pauses serve to give the melodies between them, be they of a single note, a strong, independent identity. And they are often of a single note. Now, the aestheticians musicologists like Chandrasekhar Rede, for example, who happens to belong to the same tradition as Kumarji, his Guru Bandhu, they have explicitly stated that emphasizing the Gandhara in Shri is wrong, categorically. But Kumarji does it often enough and with an intensity, which you will hear, an intensity and a sense of deliberate purpose that causes note to gain its own identity within the raga, to become a phrase in itself. So also with the Nishad, and even to a lesser extent with the Tivra Madhyam. Those familiar with Kumarji's music will know that this is something he does often and in many rags. And interestingly, phrase number 12, Dharma Gare, considered standard Shri fare by most authorities on the subject, is one that Kumarji assiduously avoids. He uses it only and exclusively, and I can't stress this enough, when he sings one bandish, Sanja Kahe Jaye Ab, which is a bandish of his own composition, which it seems he has set aside just for this phrase. So Sanja Kahe Jaye is the only bandish in which he will use Dharma Kare, in the bandish itself as well as in his improvisation in it. And also this is also the bandish where the Dhaivat gets a very strong independent identity. Now ideally a study like this should contain statistics to see which phrases are more prominent than others, since that would be an important and revealing feature of this idiolect. But suffice it for now to say that Kumarji tends to stress the Purvanga, the lower tetrachord of the rag, and keeps returning to it even as he traverses the Uttaranga. So even within the Purvanga, he centers his movements around re ga re sa pa pa re ga re sa. That is his dhun. While intermittently highlighting the ga ga re re sa na. That's what I mean by giving a phrases an independent identity. So this re ga re sa re pa re ga re sa. This is his dhun. This is the song inherent in Shri, which Kumarji tends to focus on throughout his performances, even when he's working in the Uttaranga. Acha, if we were to look at this really microscopically, perhaps the core phrase even within all this would be pare. Because if you listen to his bandishes, Risai kahe, Karana dere, Pava me durase, almost every line ends with pare. Risai kahe, mo parare, mukha utha de, bol zara, nan milai ke. This happens in the other two bandishes as well. And another thing I noticed was that Risai Kahe and Karan Dere Kachula Re Karan Dere Kachula Re Vavo Barajare Le Vo Re Karan Dere are the same composition. Risai Kahe and Karana De are the same composition. The tal is different. And the lay is different. Sorry, the lay is different. The tal is the same. The tempo is different. And Kumarji has said this in Tappa Tumri Tarana, I think, or somewhere, that ye sab lay ke khel hain. It's the same thing. The rag is the same. The lay makes it different. So with this in mind, let's listen to two short clips. I should note here that I fully expect this entire table to look suspect to the musicians here. And it would really take repeated listenings of Kumarji's performances of Shri from this perspective to be convinced of the validity of this, even the possibility of this. And I would invite you to do so. But for lack of time, let's just listen to these two short clips. I'll have a visual on screen where I have a list of these core phrases, and you'll be able to see how they come and go. This is edited, obviously. Because the intention is to come to sound. He's actually singing Sapa. Now, I'm sure this has left some of you convinced, some of you not so convinced. I must admit here that I wasn't convinced for the longest time myself that I had arrived at anything of any value. One of the criteria I had set myself here was to try to come as close as possible to the seed ideas at play in Kumarji's creative process. Is he thinking in these terms? This meant that I'd have to, at the very least, feel convinced that Kumarji was thinking in terms of these phrases. But to think of Kumarji's musical statements as either versions or combinations of preconceived phrases seemed extremely limiting and artificial and false. To think of Kumarji's phrases, Kumarji's musical statements, to think of them in terms of combinations of preconceived phrases seemed limiting and artificial and false. I really felt convinced only when I tried to rethink what these phrases or the idea of a phrase itself meant to Kumarji. Now, Kumarji has famously said that ragas are naked. It is through bandishes that we clothe them. Right? So this could be interpreted to mean that in his conception of rag, of the idea of rag, its component phrases are meaningless until they are structured into a composition, strung together and made to flow into each other, into and out of each other, which leads us to the idea that the phrase is not so much a pre-composed musical statement but a pathway, one of a set of interconnected lanes, pathways, lanes and by-lanes that allow us to navigate through a raga. Phrases for Kumarji then are not bricks that one puts together, one on top of the other to build an edifice. Although I can think of singers who might think of them in that sense, although that is another paper. Let's listen to another clip of Kumarji's Shri with this renewed understanding of these phrases to imagine Kumarji forging a route through these lanes that make up the town of Shri. Note that the previous clip contained all the phrases except Dhamagare, which does not occur even one single time in the entire performance. But the clip I'm about to play is from Sanja Kahe Jaye Ab, the bandish that does contain this phrase. Different profile of Shri. find that thinking of these phrases as relatively fixed pathways or seed ideas in the artist's conception of the rag reinforces the temporality inherent in music. Thinking of a phrase as a preconceived cluster of notes gives us a sense of stasis. Thinking of them as pathways gives us a sense of flow. This perspective is also a more nuanced and useful, even pedagogically useful way of understanding the complex relationship of the composed and the improvised in Hindustani music. Looking at a rag as a collection of independent but interconnected seed ideas or as a network of pathways helps us situate the improvised within the composed. One last comment on Kumarji's phrases before we move on to Amir Khan. While it could be argued that Kumarji's phrases stretch across a number of pauses, the nuclei of these phrases can still be shown to be the ones above. So, for example, sa, re, e, could be construed off as sa, re, as one phrase. So you could think of it as either, but the pathways are the same. So let's move on now in contrast with this to Shri according to Amir Khan to see how these ideas play out in the music of an entirely different kind of musician. So I'm going to play the excerpt for you first so that the contrast is apparent. Now, this short piece summarizes Amir Khan's Shri pretty accurately, considering the fact that unlike Kumarji, Amir Khan Sahab sings only one Bandish in Shri, and also that all of his performances, again unlike those of Kumarji's, follow a fixed sequence, a fixed order of the Bandish first, and then Alap, and then Sargam, and then Tan, with an increase in tempo. Amir Khan has been described as the state of just waking up from sleep. much longer to come to an understanding of Amir Khan's Shri. The kind of understanding that was at all convincing and that was applicable to any section of any performances of this rag. I won't bore you now with the entire process I went through, but suffice it to say that I came up with at least 3 complete sets of chord phrases in different configurations that seemed initially to me to summarize Amir Khan's conception of Shri nicely. But every time I listened to that performance or another performance again, I invariably encountered phrases that refused to fit in with any of the chord phrases I had derived. It took me a while to realize that any attempt to draw out phrases of the rag from Amir Khan Sahib's singing was actually turning out to be an imposition on his singing of the phrases of Shri that I was familiar with. It was then that it dawned on me that Khan Sahib wasn't thinking in terms of phrases at all. Not even the often quoted signature Shri phrases like re per or per re. You might hear them, of course, you might have heard them now in the performance. But the phrases occur in his singing, when they occur in this singing, they seem to be a byproduct of another process that's happening altogether. Khan Sahib certainly doesn't intend to sing these phrases, in the sense that doing so will result in a rag edifice taking shape. It turned out that I was excavating my own conception of Shri from out of Amir Khan Sahib's singing. What eventually emerged from repeated analysis of his Shri was not a set of phrases at all. It was a set of rules. Now, it's nothing new to say that Amir Khan's music is more about singing a scale than it is about singing the rag or rag phrases. This has been documented. And his preferences for singing rags like Malkauns or Todi that lend themselves to this kind of singing has also been documented. In this sense, Shri was not the ideal choice of rag for looking at Amir Khan's music. Nonetheless, his Shri did sound like Shri. And I'm pretty sure it sounded like Shri to you as well today. And it did sound different from the other rags that he sings that use the same scale. So through this process, I found a relatively simple, concise set of rules that seem to pretty much define Amir Khan's Shri and take it at least slightly beyond being just a scale towards a sense of a rag group of Shri. And these are the rules. Number 1, Khan Sahib ascends using a simple textbook Sa Re Ma Pa Ni Sa Re. I end this on Re, Sa Re Ma Pa Ni Sa Re, because Khan Sahib never halts on the upper Sa. He'll always add a tail of a Re at the end of it. He treats the Ga and the Dha notes, Gandhar and Dhaivat, as descending notes, in the sense that as he ascends to them, he never moves up through them. He always comes back down. That's rule number 2. Rule number 3, he descends through Re Sa Ni Dha Pa Ma Ga Re. This is again textbook Shri. But I mentioned the descent as starting and ending on Re again because that's what he does. He never descends to the Sa and stops there. And the crucial rule, the defining rule of his Shri, in the Alap that you heard, and for most of the Sargam sections, Khan Sahib's Shri is defined by a constant return to the Rishabh, a constant return to Re. This, in a nutshell, is his idea of Shri. Keep coming back to Re. And although it gives rise to phrases that many would raise eyebrows at, okay? For example, Ma Ga Re Ma Ga Re, which you might have heard right now, alright? So while working on the lower ranges of his range, especially while working on the Re, because as you know, Khan Sahib will work on one note and then work on the next note and then the next note and gradually ascend the octave. So while he's working on the Re itself, he will end his sentences on the lower Pa. When he's working on the higher Re, he'll end his sentences on the Madhya Pa. And he ends it on the Sa only when arriving at the Mukhda. Otherwise he does not. So it's just a return to Re, and I'd like you to look out for that now. So what I want to stress again is that when he says Per Re, he's not thinking Per Re necessarily. Of course he must know that Shri mein Per Re kiya jata hai. Of course he must. But what I noticed was he does Ma Re and Dha Re just as much as does Per Re. So Per Re holds no special significance for him at all. He's thinking scale. Now he'll begin his Merkhand process in the Tans, and in the Sargam and the Tans in the faster sections. And you'll encounter a lot of unexpected phrases typical of Khan Sahib in here, which just sort of illustrates my point. But when he begins his Sargam and his Tan, he still keeps a sense of that arrival to Re alive in his Sargam. But gradually, as he moves on to his Tan sections, it's gone. Even that is gone. Okay. The fact that keeps it sounding like Shri to us, I could think of three explanations. One is the sense that Shri has already been established before. So there's a resonance of that that keeps us thinking that this is still Shri. And of course, he sticks to the simple Sare Ma Pa Ni Sa Re Sa Ni Dha Pa Ma Ga Re Sa. And he ends phrases on Re Ga Re Sa as a rule. These three things go into keeping the sense of Shri alive. Otherwise, whether this is Shri at all or not is open to question. A volume here, please. Sir, volume, please. So like I said, Repa, Pare, typical Shri phrases hold no significance for him. And another interesting thing I found was that his Aroha, his ascent, is composed of shorter Avrohas. And vice versa, his Avrohas consists of shorter Arohas, which gives his phrases a sense of complexity, of Vakrata, of a twisted sort of movement, makes it interesting. Okay, I'd come across another interesting paper by another scholar which said that so the Merkhand Paddhati, where you take 4 notes and you have all sorts of combinations of those 4 notes to do your improvisation. So this paper by someone called Thomas Ross suggested that what Abir Khan Sahib might be doing, apart from this, in his Merkhand, in ragas like Shri or Kedar, which are more phrase-driven rags, he might be thinking of those rags as combinations of phrases. So you have phrase number 1, phrase number 2, phrase number 3, phrase number 4, and then you do a Merkhand mixing and matching of those phrases. So that seemed like a very interesting possibility, but my contention is that that is not what he's doing at all. In fact, other musicians might do that, but he's not thinking in terms of phrases at all. He's thinking in terms of scale entirely, with a set of rules, like a return to re. And I started with an example of Nicholas Magriel's paper where he analyzes Niaz Ahmad Khan Saab's Shahana. Now, Niaz Ahmad Khan Saab in his singing is closer to this kind of singing. So, which is what I mean by intentionality. He's not, Niaz Ahmad is also probably not thinking in those terms, in terms of a set of core phrases that can be derived. So, he has arrived at a set of core phrases, but those are probably his interpretation of what is happening. So, Adrian McNeill wonders in his paper, at what point does the fixed boundary of a rag start to assume a state of unfixedness? So I believe that point, as we saw here, as well as those boundaries of the rag, are defined by a complex of intra and extra musical events, including the sophistication of an artist's embodiment of the rag group, as well as his audience's familiarity with his aesthetic. For lack of a better term, a consummate artist with a sympathetic audience can define and extend those boundaries. Right? And the rag's identity will be accepted, at least within that community. There's a nice term for this. It's a community of sentiments, Regula Qureshi's term. An artist dwells and does what he does within a community of sentiment. For an unsympathetic listener, though, for one outside the artist's community of sentiment, this pushing of limits might amount to travesty. For a lot of people, this will not be acceptable at all. But I want to say, though, that we think of this as a performance of Shri because it carries that label and causes us to compare it with other idiolects or dialects of Shri. But if we disregard that label entirely, Aamir Khan's Shri is still a good work of art. It has a strong, clear aesthetic and an inherent form and structure, which is a form and structure that is common to all of Aamir Khan's music. Accepted. Though that might not be the structure that is generally accepted as the language of Shri. So it is very much an idiolect. It is Shri according to him. So the fundamental debate here is between conceiving of a rag as either a singular or a plural entity. This question has implications for everything from pedagogy to individual artistic liberty. It is interesting to note that Kumarji's idiolect of Shri is a set of phrases, which means that the relationships of the notes within those phrases is pre-decided. In other words, it is primarily a vocabulary, a set of phrases. It is a vocabulary in which its grammar is inherently expressed. The vocabulary of Aamir Khan's Shri is a simple set of 7 notes, and therefore the vocabulary is of little significance. What is more important is his grammar, a set of grammatical rules that give shape and form to his vocabulary. So the question is not just of a particular rag having a plural identity, but of the idea of rag itself being a plural idea. Grammars can be plural too, because grammars, as we have seen, can be personal. We must remember, though, while theorizing like this, that the aim is not to arrive at absolute vocabularies or grammars for these musicians. This is a comparative exercise. Thank you.
There is a fundamental notion of how you've gone about this, that there is one set of idioms, first of all. While you accept the plurality of the rag, the plurality of different, the plurality of even the idiolect within one artist is something I feel is missing and needs to be explored.
Okay.
And I'll take 2 examples from what you said. One is Kumarji's 2, shall we say, ideas of Shri. I believe they are 2 different idiolects.
2 different idiolects.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Rather than saying you put the one where he has a very big stress on Dhegla, I think it's a completely different set of idiolects compared to the other Shri.
Right.
And I think it's a conscious process.
It is, definitely.
It's not an unconscious process. And thinking of, say, from where I come from, even in a raga, let's just take a raga with a composition. And if I'm going to explore the raga in, shall we say, confluence with the composer's set of idiolects,
Okay.
I notice if I rewind in my head, it's a different set of idiolects that actually emerge. That emerge from that intentionality shift. So I find it a bit reductionist at that point.
Right.
That you don't allow for that possibility of the multiplicity. There's another place I want to point this out. One is in terms of, shall we say, splitting the notion of the raga. This is what this is. Other is laya.
Okay.
I am not I feel there is a problem in considering pari, for example, of different layers at the same code.
At the same?
As the same code.
Okay.
Because I think if we can just expand that a little bit and take laya also to be a manifestation of heritage,
Right.
then actually the pari is not the same. Right? Because its intentionality in different layers shifts everything about it. So I'm just giving you an example from what you said.
I understand.
I'm sure we can expand it with many more dimensions, but I'm just throwing this out as
Right.
a thought.
No, I understand. Also, I understand that this whole thing might be a little flawed, in the sense that you could. It's a question of to what degree you take this notion of the idiolect, right? So, for example, pari, as you mentioned, you could have different manifestations of pari within the same layer, and of course with a different layer as well. But I think what the takeaway from this is that this concept exists, that you could have different idiolects of.
No, my only fear in going in this direction
Yeah.
is that I do believe there are idiolects. I don't think there can be an argument on. Artists know it in subconscious sense.
Right.
But I think the problem there is giving it one monolithic notion per
Correct.
artist
Yeah.
or per raga.
Yeah.
Because I think that also in a way can expand the notion of the raga itself. So I'm just saying, can we create a little variability
Right.
even in looking at the idiolect, not just laya, but in terms of even, for example, perspective. Because I think the sound changes between the two, not just because there is a dha.
Right.
There is something else in operation there.
Okay.
And that something else is a completely different set of personalities that is being manifested. So it's just a
Right.
thought.
I think Nadrup is a nice word for this. It's a different Nadrup because of that. No, I agree. I mean, yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that.
A certain point. For instance, when Kumarji sings a prominent Rishabha, Shankara, right?
Yeah.
That would be quite startling for most of us who know Shankara.
Right.
Now, so if you talk of that as an idiolect, the danger is that beyond a point we may not even recognize the raga. I mean, for me, it's fine when Kumarji,
Stresses the Gandhara or.
for something. But the problem with talking of idiolects, I agree that there is such a thing as an artist's conception of Virana. Also dependent on what bandish is. Okay, that's all there. The profile of the raga that emerges when you sing a particular bandish is going to be different. Ideally it should be. But this idea of idiolect, if pushed beyond a certain point, can logically lead to even dissolution of the idea of the raga itself.
But the thing is, now for example, then you're talking about a frame of reference. That this is an idiolect as compared to what? What is the standard Shri? Right? So now if you compare Shri as given in say Bhatkhande, or Jha Sahab's conception of Shri, or Chandrasekhar Rede's conception of Shri, these three are different. They write about Shri, they give its notation in a different way. So Ratan Jankar and Devdhar, and these were the people who tried to give these ragas a more definite root. Before that, you find so many examples of bandishes, of older bandishes.
Bhatkande's book savings of composition we don't understand.
We don't understand. They don't make sense now, So I mean, I just want to say that rather than thinking of ragas as standard, well-defined things, as many of us like to say, and it is not even untrue to a certain extent. But the idea of rag, of there being a framework of melody, a framework of sound, within which you operate and which provides a sort of a railing for your creativity to take off from. Just keeping it at that is good enough, often, rather than trying to define what each particular framework has to be. It's again about finding your own balance